Chapter 40 Ghosts on the Coast. Ariel. 5 days after her return to Dragonstone, the loss of Fang had started to settle into her bones. She wasn't over the mutilation Fang suffered, nor the anger at whomever had dared. But when she woke up, it only took a few seconds before she remembered he was dead. She knew he wouldn't be down in Hagrid's magical chest, and she no longer felt a hollow longing that made her want to weep. In a way, she'd accepted it had happened, but she didn't forgive. Life moved on, though a new normal felt lacking without the overgrown boarhound. She didn't need to take him for a walk, to get him food and water. He'd never again be left with Ariel for the night in her chamber, waking her up with a paw to her face like a rude slap whenever she'd slept too long for his preferences. It had been 5 empty days since his murder. They'd held a small private funeral on Dragonstone where Norbert burned his body, turning him to ash, except for a few necessary keepsakes, and collected in an urn. Though once more Ariel was made to feel heartbroken and awful all over again, because the situation still managed to get worse. Before breakfast, Ariel had been stopped outside the dining chamber by her personal maid Eliza, who came to inform her that Hagrid needed her for an urgent situation. That situation turned out to be an early morning visitor. The former kennelmaster of the Red Keep had paid a sizable chunk of his meager savings to pay for a passage on a cargo ship headed from King's Landing to Dragonstone, and brought along his 1-year-old daughter and a very pregnant wife to beg Hagrid for an utterly unnecessary pardon. Apparently, after what happened to Fang, the king had not been able to find the culprit, but he had fired his kennelmaster. With head bowed and grasping his hat before his chest, Corp had explained the situation. How he'd been interrogated by the City Watch, which was likely where he got his split lip and bruised face. But though he'd been cleared of any involvement with the kidnapping itself, he'd been sacked from his post and lost his family's only livelihood, because Fang had gone missing while on his watch. So now he was here, begging their forgiveness in hopes it'd help him get his job back. "Of course," Hagrid blustered, gesticulating sharply with his bear-sized hands. "Of course I forgive you. You had nothing to do with it. We know that. We knew that the whole time. You were looking for him all evening, and then you came and asked me for help. When were you supposed to be involved with this? You tried your best to help us too. I can't believe you did this." Ariel had been surprised to see Corp on Dragonstone too, but after hearing what happened, maybe not as surprised as Hagrid. As the kennelmaster of the Red Keep, Corp had enjoyed quite a secure job. To be the kennelmaster of a castle was an enviable position, and though Corp was no noble, most nobles of the Red Keep knew Corp. His job was to be a good huntsman and dog trainer. He joined every outing and raised and trained all the hounds used during the royal hunts. It was a good position, and Ariel understood why he'd be desperate enough to come to Dragonstone in hopes of getting it back. Losing a respectable position was always difficult, but it was the middle of winter, and he had a family to provide for. It was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The part that surprised her was to realize how the royal family had likely fired Corp to please them. Because what other reason would there be to fire Corp when they knew the only crime he'd committed was eating supper? With no culprit to offer up, they went ahead and fired a crucial member of their staff under the delusion this was somehow justice for what happened to Fang, all in a failed attempt to please Hagrid, which gave Ariel pause. In theory, many could do Corp's job, but the hounds knew him. Though the dogs belonged to the Targaryens, they had been raised, trained, and knew Corp as their true master, and didn't give a damn about either titles, gold, or politics. To suddenly make them listen to a new master couldn't be done in a day, and she could only imagine how hard it was for Corp to be away from his dogs too. He'd made it his life's mission to raise the best hunting dogs possible for the royal family, and she knew how precious dogs could become, even when they weren't technically yours. "Lord Rubius will write to the king on your behalf," Ariel said, a promise that made Hagrid glance sharply at her with a hint of alarm. She nodded discreetly, wordlessly confirming she'd be the one writing it, while he only had to leave his signature at the end. One of these days he needed to continue Hagrid's writing lessons. It hadn't gone well the first time, but this illiteracy could not continue now that he was a bloody lord. "Including a complete pardon of any perceived wrongdoing on our behalf, with a request you be granted back your station," Ariel said. "It's an injustice it was taken from you to begin with. Had we been made aware, we'd have pressed the decision before leaving King's Landing. Thank you, Lord Rubius. That is most generous of you. Corp bent so low he was almost on his knees. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. Me and my wife thanks you. Hagrid turned as red as a strawberry, but Harry couldn't tell if it was from anger about the situation or embarrassment over a grown man acting so grateful and subservient towards him.
It's nothing. We want to help.
Hagrid nodded fervently.
In fact, I think I could do more too. Where are you staying?
The inn down by the docks, my lord, Corp said.
Not anymore. I'll sort you out here instead,
Hagrid insisted. That's most generous of you, my lord. You honor us.
Rubbish. You came all this way over a stupid misunderstanding. I'm not sending you away to spend unnecessary coins on a cold room at the inn you'd have to share with 5 strangers, when I'm perfectly able to sort you out, Hagrid said decisively, almost challenging someone to protest. But no one did. Except himself. Hagrid paused, then gave Harry another one of those uncertain glances as when he'd feared he had to write a letter in common, because once more this wasn't actually a situation he'd experienced before. Do I go directly to the princess? Standing on the tips of her toes in a fruitless attempt to get closer to his ear, she whispered,
You can, but she'll be leaving soon. Though you don't actually need their permission. You can invite them to stay in your own right too. Just remember to inform the steward so he's aware they're not intruders. Humming and understanding, Hagrid turned back to the kennel master and his family.
Come with me. You can stay here until we get a response from King's Landing. You might have to wait a bit though. It normally takes a few days with post ravens, both to fly there and to get back with a response. Ravens are just slower and not as smart as owls, you know, but that's how it's done here.
While Hagrid made arrangements for Corp's family to have a place to stay, Ariel went to join Alisa in the doorway. The maid was smiling, her lavender eyes crinkling in amusement from watching the entire ordeal. Thank you, Ariel said as Alisa held the door open for her. I'll be gone all day. Maybe it'd be better to write that letter over breakfast. Do you want me to fetch parchments, ale and quill for you, my lady? Ariel bit her lip. It was all the way across the castle, which would eat into her already limited time. She was glad Corp had stopped by, but the visit also meant she was behind schedule. Judging by the position of the sun, it wasn't too bad, but she'd have to rush through her breakfast. Because regardless of how good an excuse was at fault for a delay, one just didn't make Princess Rhaenyra wait. Would you mind? That would be of great help. Of course, my lady, Alisa confirmed. I'll get it right away and bring it to the dining chamber. Thank you so much. You're a blessing, Alisa, Ariel said. You wouldn't happen to have heard from the Dragon Keepers this morning, though? Alisa shook her head. No, my lady, but since we haven't, I expect it means the dragons are cooperating and there's nothing of importance to report. Ariel nodded. You're probably right. Though if one of the dragons are going to be a problem for the handlers to settle up, it'll be Norbert. Syrax is too well behaved. Syrax is a graceful and courtly dragon, as is fitting for our future queen, Alisa insisted. Aye, she is. If I may say, Lord Rubius is coming into his lordship well, Alisa said as they reached the stairs. Bemused, she peered at Alisa from the corner of her eye, because Hagrid's fumbling wasn't any lord or lady's idea of proper conduct. There are many new responsibilities for him to familiarize himself with, but he'll find his footing. He always does. Hagrid's a sturdy fellow. Aye, that he is, Alisa chuckled. Though, may I speak plainly, my lady? Sensing this was more than a laundry update, Ariel slowed her strides until they came to a stop at the top of the staircase. What's on your mind? The silver-haired maid fidgeted, acting more like an uncertain schoolgirl than the witty woman of 29 she was. I've been meaning to ask. That is, I hope you've been pleased by my services during your years at Dragonstone. Of course, I would have been lost without your guidance, which is no figure of speech. How many times did you save me from walking into the weapon storage during my first moon in the castle? The memory made both of them smile, and Alisa nodded. If it pleases you, my lady, I hope you'll allow me to continue my services after your marriage to Prince Aemon too. Of everything she might have brought up, that wasn't anywhere near what Hariel had guessed. You wish to come with me to Cracklaw? Aye, if I may be so bold, I assume Lord Rubius will require a new staff at his new castle. My husband is an able stable hand, and my 2 eldest sons are old enough to be of service, and it won't be long until my youngest are able to work as well. Alisa's eldest was 11 years old, so that was a stretch. But considering she'd seen 4-year-olds being set to work in the fields, Hariel understood the sentiment. I'd be delighted to keep you with me, Alisa, Hariel said. This is your family's choice, and I will not force you to move anywhere unless it's your express preference to join us. Though you're right, there will be a need for a new staff at Cracklaw. So if you do decide to relocate, I will make sure your family receives good positions. Whenever that move is. She chuckled. You do understand it might be a while off yet. Alisa nodded seriously. I do, milady. I've heard talks of many grand plans which must wait for winter's end to begin. Even then it'll be years to build, but I thought to make my preferences clear, milady. So you knew, if you need hands to aid you along, my family is always at your service. Alisa's request made Hariel feel warmer than she had since Fang's death. That means a lot to me. I'm grateful, Alisa, and I won't forget. As always, Alisa came through like the angel she was, running across the castle to fetch Hariel's equipment and bring it back so she could start writing Corp's pardon. Princess Rhaenyra wasn't at breakfast, which meant she'd already finished or was eating in her apartments. Either way, Hariel was short on time. Putting aside a half-eaten plate of sausage and sauced beans, she set to copy the missive she'd mentally constructed in her mind, writing in as small a font as she could possibly muster. Though seeing Hariel magic parts of the breakfast table into her writing desk made Jay scoff. This is a dining chamber, Hariel, not a study. I don't have time, Hariel said distracted, her nose an inch away from the strip of parchment, and her tongue jutted out in concentration. Realizing he wouldn't get much tangible from her, Jace addressed her maid instead. Elise, what's this about? Her name's Alisa, Hariel muttered. Oh, what's Hariel writing, Alisa, and why can't it wait? Lady Hariel is writing a missive on Lord Rubius' behalf to His Grace King Viserys, my prince. It's done with haste because your mother agreed to join Lady Hariel on a trip to Cracklaw after breakfast, and she doesn't wish to keep the princess waiting. But why does she need to write our grandfather? Luke asked. Hariel was too busy concentrating on composing her text to keep listening in. Not only did the letter need to be eloquent, direct and urgent at the same time, but writing a pardon on such a small space as a raven-carried piece of parchment with ink and quill could be considered an art form. When Alisa saw Hariel put away her quill to reach for her breakfast, she stepped forwards to save the missive from food spillage too. Do you want me to bring this to Lord Rubius? That'd be most helpful, and please remind me to sign it. Thank you, Alisa. With Corp's letter sorted out, Hariel could return to the most important meal of the day. Acting more like a starving wolf than a lady, Hariel nearly inhaled the rest of her breakfast, ignoring Rhaena's unimpressed glare from across the table. At least chew before you swallow, Hariel. You're going to choke, Rhaena said, long-suffering, daintily piercing her fork through her scrambled eggs and taking a gentle bite. It was as odd to see Rhaena without Bela as it was to visit Hagrid without Fang there to greet her. Rhaena had been quietly reduced since her sister's disastrous wedding and the news of Luke being disinherited, yet seeing Hariel act so unladylike was bringing back some of her old spark. I don't have time. A few crumbs ended up accidentally spewing out since Hariel answered while chewing down a mouthful of bread. The carelessness left Rhaena outraged, but Joffrey laughed delighted and clapped, shouting, Again! In the meanwhile, little Visenya stared deadspan at Hariel, as if judging her an uneducated simpleton, a peculiar expression on the pudgy face of a 2-year-old. Then again, what else could she expect? It was Visenya. No, Joffrey, Hariel did a bad thing. That is not what we do at the table. Food stays inside the mouth. Rhaena stressed the point seriously. In response, Joffrey took a bite of his eggs only to spit it out laughing. Joffrey, no, we do not spit food like a wildling. That is not princely conduct, she scolded. I swear you will not get the visit to Raxus for a week if you do that again. Joffrey stuck out his tongue. I mean it, Joffrey. I'll let Visenya join me to visit the dragons while you must stay here. No, I want to play with Tyraxis! Joffrey protested fiercely. However, Rhaena might have been better to use a different threat, because the boy was as outraged to be left out of the dragon visit as his sister found it upsetting to be forced to join. Visenya's expression twisted from unimpressed to disgust, leaving Rhaena with 2 displeased kids instead of 1. It was something Hariel had noticed, that everyone had noticed, but didn't speak about aloud. How Visenya didn't like dragons the way her mother would have preferred. Back when Visenya was around 6 months old, Rhaenyra had tried putting her daughter in swaddling clothes, and climbed onto Syrax to take her to fly for the first time, just as she'd done with all her sons before. To this day, it remained Visenya's first and last trip on Dragonback, seeing as Hariel had heard the child cry from the moment they set off to long after they landed. Visenya found the fire-breathing creatures rather terrifying, which meant each visit nearly always ended in loud tantrums, even with the silver-scaled Thunderstrike, who was supposed to be her dragon. The girl was only 2 years old though, and as anyone with common sense could attest to, being wary of dragons was a rather instinctual thing to be. Rhaenyra kept good faith her daughter would grow out of it and become just as enthused as her brothers, though only time would tell if that was wishful thinking or not. Though the princess showed indulgent patience for her only daughter, the same could not be said for Hariel. Whilst Rhaena was distracted by the kids, Hariel took the opening to flee the chamber, both because she truly was running late and to avoid the etiquette lecture poor Joffrey was currently being subjected to. Well fed, rested, and dressed for the icy bite of winter winds, Hariel made it to the dragons just in time to see Princess Rhaenyra climb onto Syrax's dragon saddle. Hariel still hadn't heard from Aemond, but instead Princess Rhaenyra had agreed to fly out to visit Cracklaw. She hoped to hear from Aemond soon, or from anyone in the capital, be it Bella or Helena, but the silence wasn't unexpected either. It had only been 5 days since Aegon's fall from the Belfry, 4 days since Hariel left King's Landing, and 3 days since Rhaenyra and her family returned to the Isle. Even if Aemond fought to right, a raven couldn't make that trip the way a ship or a dragon could. If the winds were bad, it could take a week for a raven to make the flight, if it wasn't lost to the cold winds and sea along the way, because then they'd never reach their destination at all. In hindsight, Hariel felt guilty about how they'd said farewell. The last Hariel talked to Aemond, she'd been exhausted, furious, and grieving over Fang, and she might have been a bit too insensitive about his troubles, almost glossing over Aegon's hurts because she was too caught up with herself, even suggesting he leave his brother's sickbed for flying and fun. Safe to say, things had felt awkward. Then again, Hariel and Aemond weren't the only ones affected. It seemed like the whole castle was left in disarray. Aegon's fall and the security breach disrupted everything from Lord Borros' morning routine, to people being in places they shouldn't, to nearly every task in the Red Keep being delayed. Such as how when the royal steps saw an influx for the morning ceremony, there'd been a line of people outside unable to get in, to how Hariel and Hagrid ended up leaving through the front gate at the same time as the leftovers from the wedding feast was being carted out to the city to feed the poorest in the afternoon. Normally, the throne room would have been cleaned, the leftover food gathered and sent into the city at the crack of dawn the day after the feast, clearing the throne room back to its normal state to hold court. But it seems everyone was running behind schedule that day. Since returning to Dragonstone, the last Hariel heard of Aegon's condition was from an update Rhaenyra received just before she left King's Landing. Allegedly, the milk of the puppy had a heavy effect on Aegon, harder than it affected most others, keeping him asleep for disquietingly long stretches of time, and the few times he woke up he was pretty incoherent, except for the sounds of pain. Though the latest change was that he'd caught a fever, which was not a good sign, and that was 3 days ago. Until they knew more, Hariel found the best way not to worry was to keep busy. Even while there was so much out of her control, there were still ways to be productive. Outside, the dragons had been lured out of their nests by the dragon keepers with food all the way up to the yard for the princess's comfort, which meant Norbert was fully saddled and ready to fly when Hariel joined them. Her headlong neck turned, eyes lighting up at the sight of Hariel, blood dripping down her jaw while Norbert chewed satisfied at what might have been a pig not too long ago. "Hello, Norbert. Are you ready to fly?" With her mouth full of charred limbs, Norbert settled for an agreeable grunt that had fiery sparks flaring out of her nostrils. Syrax cocked her head sideways, listening curiously to the slithering Parsisaltan. The yellow-scaled dragon had never learned the snake language and could do no more than react to the familiar yet foreign sounds. Syrax had heard it before though, as Ariel wasn't the only one who spoke in persistent tongue anymore. Agnes's daycare, full of rambunctious baby dragons, all babbled away in persistent tongue too. They'd grown up with Ariel's presence in a similar way as Norbert did, and were now deferring to the snake language nearly as often as they used their natural dragon speech. Anticipation filled her chest, and despite this first and foremost being an errand, Ariel was excited to fly. It was one of several freedoms she was denied whenever she was stuck in the stifling Red Keep in King's Landing. "Good morning, Ariel," Rhaenyra said. The sudden jostling hadn't fazed the princess, who knew well how to stick to the saddle regardless of what unexpected movements her dragon made, and continued to secure herself with straps to the dragon saddle. "Good morning, princess. I hope I didn't keep you waiting." The princess arched an elegant brow. "No, I arrived just ahead of you." "Morning, Lady Ariel," Sir Carl said. He'd been waiting with the dragon handlers, but Norbert's fiery snores made him take a cautionary step away. Ariel took stock of the Dark Knight's equipment and warm attire, as well as how it matched with Sir Stefan, who was currently climbing onto Cyrex, taking the passenger seat built into the saddle behind Rhaenyra. Ariel hadn't seen much of Sir Carl since Laenor's funeral, but the beard he'd been growing had filled in. She'd once carried affections for the dark, tall and handsome knight, but it'd been a doomed crush that came to a brutal end after accidentally catching him fucking Sir Laenor. After getting such an eyeful, there were no options but to let go of the childhood fancy. Though in the immediate aftermath there had been moments she felt embarrassed about her unrequited feelings, and had for a while made it a habit to avoid him entirely. Until one day they passed each other in the hallway, and to her surprise, Ariel found it wasn't that big of a deal. She still thought Sir Carl handsome, even if the beard had aged him, but he didn't give her butterflies in her stomach anymore. She was thankful for that, because though he didn't display it openly, Ariel could tell Sir Laenor's death affected him. "Morning, Sir Carl. Are you joining us to Cracklaw today?" She'd known Rhaenyra wouldn't travel alone. Even with her magic, they didn't count Ariel as a proper guard, and for some reason neither did two dragons. To see Rhaenyra bringing Sir Stefan was expected, but judging by how Sir Carl was dressed, it appeared he would be coming to Cracklaw as well. "I am," Sir Carl said. "For your protection, my lady." "The more the merrier," Ariel said, though there was only one available seat left, and it was not on Cyrex. "You've flown on a dragon before, have you not? On Sea Smoke?" Sir Carl nodded, his polite smile faltering at the mention of Sir Laenor's dragon. "Aye. I was allowed to travel with Sir Laenor as his guard during errands around the Crownlands. I've flown to Driftmark as well as King's Landing and Duskendale." "Then you know what to expect. It's good. That makes one of us, because Norbert has never taken an additional passenger before." Ariel adjusted the tightness of her scarf, casting a thoughtful glance between Norbert and the suddenly rigid knight. "I guess this will be interesting." Cracklaw was a peninsula of valleys and rich woodlands, protruding from the Crownlands into the narrow sea, with the Bay of Crabs to the north, the Gullet on the southern side, and Essos beyond the eastern horizon. On Dragonback, traveling to Cracklaw was easy. They set off from Dragonstone flying north across the Gullet until they saw the coastline of the Wild Peninsula. The two she-dragons glided across the ocean, one after the other. Cyrex was older and just shy of a head bigger than Norbert, but the blue dragon was faster. Ariel tried to follow orderly after the princess, but her young dragon was much too restless to cruise along, and would entertain herself by doing dives and changing directions, making sudden movements which never failed to make Sir Carl squawk and clutch at the saddle for dear life. To reach their destination, they had to follow the shore as it arced northeast, all the way until the very edge, to the point of Cracklaw itself. Standing at the edge of the point, one could stare into the sunrise, and knowing the next sign of land would be the Braavosi coastland of Essos. Ariel had already flied out there with Norbert a couple of days before, though they'd kept airborne without landing. The total landmass was comparable to Driftmark, just stretched from the point along the northern coast of Cracklaw until a deep valley that signaled the border to the lands of House Bruin of Diarden, as well as a sizable bog that bordered the lands of House Bruin of Brown Hollow, a cousin house of the former. They could have flown directly to Hagrid's land, to the point, but they'd agreed to make a stop by House Bruin first. When the inhabitants of Brown Hollow saw the dragons land in their castle yard, it was an understatement to say they were warmly welcomed. "Had I but known to expect you, Your Grace, I'd have made appropriate preparations. But House Bruin is always honored to host the princess. Wherever I have a home, you will always be welcomed beneath my roof and at my table." Sir Roger Brune was the Lord of Brownhollow, a rugged man Hariel once briefly met during a wedding at Claw Isle a few years back. At the time, Hariel had yet to learn Common Tongue well enough to hold polite small talk with strangers, though it only took a single look for her to recognize the shaggy-haired man with amber eyes. "We will not intrude on your hospitality for long, Lord Roger." Princess Rhaenyra accepted this invitation with dignified charm. "We'll stay for lunch, but then we must take our leave. This is a day excursion, and we have another stop to make before we'll return to Dragonstone." Hariel was curious to explore Hagrid's land itself, and the stop at House Brune delayed that. Yet it was a pretty crucial courtesy call. One day House Brune and House Brownhollow would be her closest neighbors, as well as House Crab, but they mostly kept to their castle out on Crab Isle. She knew how necessary it was to build a good relationship with her neighbors, though it could prove difficult for Hariel and Hagrid, because Cracklaw was generally considered half-wild and distrustful of intruders. Her reputation made Hariel nervous about Hagrid's welcome. If they considered people living in Duskendale and the Crownlands intruders, then what would they make of a magical half-giant from another world? Their most convincing selling point when it came to making neighborly alliances would be Hariel's marriage. Though distrustful of strangers, the people of Cracklaw had been fierce dragon loyalists since the Conquest, where they surrendered to Aegon the Conqueror without opposition. Still, Hariel wished Aemond was there too. He was better at politics than her. He picked up on underlying meanings in specific phrases, and he was never shy about making his opinions clear either. Though all in all, Rhaenyra might have proven more convincing in the end. They'd flown to Brownhollow to tell Lord Rhaegar of the extensive building project intended for Cracklaw, but the princess somehow managed to present the changes as if the entire point was to reward the houses of the peninsula for their loyalty, instead of Hagrid. "A new dragon sanctuary," Lord Rhaegar said. "Here, out over by the point." Despite being uninvited guests, Lord Rhaegar Brune had his servants clear out the great hall of Brownhollow, light the fireplaces at full blaze, and whip together a mouth-watering lunch of roasted red herring seasoned with salt and pepper, served with baked onions, minced carrots, fresh bread, and a dark red Dornish wine. He seemed delighted to host the princess, hear news from the south, and learn as much as possible about the ambitious development plans for Cracklaw. "Aye, the king has approved of the plans, and Rubius Hagrid will be the lord of the new keep," Rhaenyra said. "Do you remember him?" "Do I remember him?" Lord Rhaegar laughed, slapping his thigh as he did. "I doubt anyone who meets him can possibly forget his visage." Rhaenyra laughed, polite but short. "Lord Rubius is an old man of 68, unwed and without children. As his legal heir is Lady Hariel here." At the mention of her name, Hariel looked up from her fish with a smile, trying to look confident, yet not too confident. Made easier because Rhaenyra just made it sound like Hagrid was at death's door, when the ironic truth was that he obviously had many decades left. "She's been my ward for 4 years, and she's been betrothed to marry my younger brother Aemond." Lord Roger nodded slowly. "I see. So your brother will come to live with his lady wife out on the point of Cracklaw once this dragon sanctuary is completed." "You've got the gist of it, my lord. This is recent. The agreement was struck less than a fortnight ago, and the new dragon sanctuary will be some of your neighbors, and be known under the name the Dragon Point." This was the first time Hariel heard the name Dragon Point, as she turned slowly to look at Rhaenyra. They'd already settled for a name? Then again, why wouldn't they? The Dragon Sanctuary would remain under Targaryen rulership, even if said sanctuary happened to be on the same lands Hagrid was gifted, though that was their point for betrothing Hariel to Aemond. "The Dragon Point? That seems a fitting name, princess." Lord Roger sipped his wine, his perfectly regal dining manners almost at odds with his rugged looks. "I appreciate that you came to me in person to keep me informed too. These are matters better discussed face to face than by the brief words carried on Raven." "May I ask?" Hariel trailed off, waiting expectantly to see if either Rhaenyra or Lord Brune thought her rude to butt in. She was here to observe, not to speak, but she had questions. Rhaenyra gave her permission. "What is it, Hariel? How come the land is unused? Why are there only ruins there?" "It's not entirely unused," Lord Brune corrected, his tone getting gruff and hard the moment he was addressing Hariel instead of the heir to the throne.
If you're coming to live there, surely you know of the little village.
Ariel nodded. Port Point? I'm aware of the village. I ask why it's not lands under the rulership of Brownhollow, the Brune of Diarden, or even House Crab. As far as I've learned, it was seized by the Crown during the conquest, but even then there wasn't a clear lord out there. Lord Brune took the time to cut and take a bite out of his fish before answering.
It's hard to reach. There are no roads, and the only path is by trekking through the lands of House Brownhollow, through the valleys, which are treacherous, because the only other alternative is to struggle through the Blue Wisps.
The Blue Wisps?
The Blue Wisps is a massive bog that divides my land from your land. Lord Brune clarified, a menacing smile spreading across his face, uncaring about displaying the piece of fish stuck between his teeth before his royal company. It's been the watery grave of many travelers trying to reach the end of the point. The water is deep, the mud heavy. It goes on, and the entire time a traveler must always be on guard against the leaping fires of the water.
Pardon?
They're the wandering spirits of unworthy men and sullied women, and their blue lights lures travelers into sinkholes to drown. Rhaegar stabbed his fork into the meat of his red herring, his ember eyes piercing, tabbing their victims to join their number forever.
There are ghosts in the bog? Ghost stories.
Ariel wasn't sure what she'd expected, but it wasn't ghost stories. Ariel hoped they were imagined ghost stories, as that could pose a problem if it wasn't. Aye, lass, Lord Brune said roughly. Does the dead frighten you?
I found the living cause more harm to other lives than the dead do, Ariel said, the memory of Fang's mutilated body flashing vivid in her mind, so clear she could almost smell it. Though certainly they can be a bother. I understand why some people don't like living on haunted lands. We had them back home too, though the ghosts I knew were quite peaceful.
Pardon?
Lord Brune faltered, and Ariel heard the princess sigh. I mean, I can't speak for the behavior of every ghost. I didn't talk with all of them. They had their own lives, or should I say afterlife to get on with. There was also Peeves, a poltergeist. He amused himself emptying buckets of water on people and giving wrong directions to anyone who got lost in the corridors. I wonder how ghosts react to dragons though. As I understand, they usually keep their human fears, so likely they'd be as scared of dragons in death as they would be in life. Though it's a very redundant fear. No one can die twice.
Lord Brune arched his bushy brow. Don't be so cocksure of that, lass.
I see you're both fascinated with ghost stories, but maybe it's better to keep the tales of demons, squishes and selkies for another time. There's a time and a place, and we must take our leave soon.
Rhaenyra cut Ariel off, placing her hand on her shoulder with a gentle squeeze. A wordless signal to...
Shut up right now. Your stories are getting too foreign for this audience and you're starting to sound insane. Again. The Blue Wisps might be a hindrance for those on foot, but those of us with ships and dragons can get there easily enough.
Lord Brune looked away slowly from Ariel, as if he didn't know what to make of her. Aye, Your Grace. Granted, the weather is nice, it's reachable for anyone with ships. Though the tall cliffs along the shore means docking and getting to land can be done anywhere you please. Port Point Village has settled where it was easiest to get access to land without having to climb a cliffside. No risk shipwrecking on the sharp rocks just below the surface.
We'll be well familiarized with the voyage soon enough. Once winter ends we can start building, and ships will be sailing between the Dragon Point and Dragonstone, some likely from King's Landing too.
These plans are a bold undertaking, Princess. Though I, for one, am looking forward to improving Brownhollow's relationship with His Grace, and to finally meet your younger brother as well. I believe having a Targaryen on Cracklaw promises prosperity and good things to come. That reminds me, how are things faring down in the capital? I heard your other brother, Prince Aegon, is to be married to Lady Baela Targaryen. The mood sobered, and the rest of the visit was spent updating Lord Rhaegar on their disastrous wedding.
The sun had just passed the afternoon position when they left Brownhollow. They flew over the lands of House Brune, seeing little but forest until they crossed an area where the trees began growing further apart. The ground visible beneath the light thicket was covered in snow, hiding what Ariel suspected was the bog underneath. The Blue Wisps Rhaegar had talked of. The winter had made the acres of bog all the more treacherous, since now it was impossible to tell what lurked beneath the snow. Norbert dropped a little height, sniffing and exploring the lands as much as Heriel was. They skirted over the treetops of blood-bogged woods until they could see vague outlines of houses in the distance. Rhaenyra steered Cyrex towards the coast of the Bay of Crabs and the village, but Heriel kept onwards. Peering over her shoulder, she saw Sir Carl's flushed face squinting against the wind current. His head was wrapped in a fur hat, but his brown beard and dark eyelashes were tipped with frost. "Do you mind if we take a lap of the area, Sir Carl?" Heriel called to her passenger, most of her volume drowned by the roaring winds.
Do it!
Enjoying a bird's-eye view of the scenery, they soared above thick pine forests cloaked in snow, the pale powdery blanket covering the ground reflecting the afternoon sunlight, which hurt her eyes whenever she stared at the brightness too long. So now and then the evergreens peeked out, a branch here or a trunk there, breaking the endless whiteness with a peak of color. They flew ahead, reaching a clearing of rolling hills, passing over a castle ruin and out towards the point itself, until she soared straight across the edge, the ground below becoming restless ocean. At Heriel's suggestion, Norbert landed on a tall and gnarly sea track just off the coast. "Phew," Heriel breathed, letting go of the reins, rolling her shoulders and stretching out her numb fingers. "What do you think, Norbert? Do you like flying here?" "It smells like fish and forest and sea," Norbert said. Upbeat enough, Heriel took that to be a good thing. "Smells better than home." Heriel knew what she meant. Vhagar might adore the odor of the volcano, but Heriel did not. And though Norbert was rather neutral to the smell itself, she claimed it sometimes covered scent trails, which he didn't like. "That's good. I think you'll have a lot of fun here. Look at all the caves to explore." "These are good caves," Norbert agreed. And if there were any ghosts living in those caves, Heriel was sure they'd be more scared of Norbert than she'd be of them. The thought reminded her of something else too. Could dogs become ghosts? If so, she could think of one ghost she wouldn't mind haunting her. "Are you well, Sir Carl?" "I am, Lady Heriel," the knight replied, shaking out his hand as if it pained him. Back on land, without a constant wind in her ears, Heriel's range of hearing got better. There was still a breeze blowing in from the east, dragging along the unruly ocean waves until they smashed against the cavernous cliffside. Yet there was another sound too, low and barely discernible beyond the rumbling sea. She lifted her head off her ears, hoping that it'd make the sound easier to identify. "Sir Carl, do you hear that?" I think I do. You mean that odd sound?" "Is that voices? It sounds like whispers on the wind." If the western bog was haunted, maybe the shore suffered the same undead company. The hollow moans on the breeze were eerie, giving Heriel goosebumps. If the point was this haunted, was the area even livable? Peeves had been bad enough alone, but this sounded like a lot more than one. "It sounds like a ghost choir," Heriel said uneasily. "Do you think the ghosts of the blue wisps might be haunting the shore as well?" "It's possible," Sir Carl answered, and his tone was such Heriel turned around because it almost sounded amused. "But if it's not ghosts, squishers or grumpkins, mayhaps it's just the wind and waves pouring into the cliff caves over there, and what we're hearing are their echoes." "Oh," Heriel said, the cause dawning on her. It had been in front of her the entire time. She looked over the many wind-carved holes in the cliffside, the hard rock left with deep wounds after ages of combat against waves and winds. "I know better than to dismiss magic whilst in your company, my lady, but know I've heard similar sounds from caves in the stepstones too. And though there's been more than enough blood spilled in those waters to give grounds for tales of vengeful hauntings, I never saw an actual ghost." Well, there she went, cooking up ghost stories for a perfectly natural phenomenon. Hanging around on a sea track turned out to be quite exposing to winds and salty ocean spray, and the princess would be waiting, so they set off soon after with violent flaps on Norbert's massive leathery wings. They flew back in the same direction they'd come from, while Harry looked around, attempting to picture what it would be like to live here, for this view to become part of her daily life. Even in winter and from above, Ariel could recognize the land had a wild beauty, with dramatic cliffs, deep caves, and rich forests. Once she tried, it wasn't difficult to picture dragons living here too. She could see them taking advantage of the cavernous hills, using the naturally formed caves to make nests. Ariel could imagine Aemond visiting Vermithor out on the hills, Vhagar snoring on the shore, Hagrid exploring the Bloodbark woods and becoming as familiar with them as he'd been with the Forbidden Forests. And, for a shiny second, she imagined Fang running happily across the fields. But no, he'd never get to do that. Norbert carried them to Port Point, where Syrinx and the princess had gathered a crowd. They'd landed by the village well, and Sir Stefan had climbed off Syrinx, for the dual purpose of protecting the princess from the crowd and the crowd from Syrinx. The commotion did not lessen when Norbert joined the party. Though the villagers likely saw dragons fly in the sky from time to time, having two massive fire breathers and their riders land in the middle of Port Point was probably the most exhilarating event the modest fishing village had experienced in years, if not decades. Judging by the sizable crowd, the entire village was present, everyone pouring onto the snowy streets to see what was going on, gaping, pointing, whispering, shouting, and generally awed by the dragons and the regal princess.
Look! Dragons! It's dragons, Banana!
Yes, I see them too. I've not gone blind yet, Gred. What do they want? Is there a war afoot?
Is it the king?
Is it Prince Daemon? Do either of those dragons look red to you? No, it's the princess! The crowd was quiet when Sir Stefan raised his voice, bellowing above them all.
Dwellers of Port Point, you are in the presence of Rhaenyra of House Targaryen, rider of the dragon Syrinx, princess of Dragonstone and heir to the Iron Throne.
Since Sir Stefan was going through proper introductions, it seemed Rhaenyra had decided to have a word with the townsfolk. Sir Stefan gestured to Norbert.
This is the princess's ward, Ariel of House Potter of Britain, rider of the dragon Norbert and betrothed to Prince Aemond Targaryen.
Rhaenyra leaned forwards and did her best to cast her voice from Syrinx's back. I have come amongst you at this time, as much as a messenger as your princess. Over a century past, your ancestors joined the cause of Aegon the Conqueror, and fought for his kingdom as some of our fiercest soldiers. Faithful and honorable men sacrifice blood to the soil we stand on, and House Targaryen acknowledges the worth of Cracklaw. I come amongst you today to show, beyond bare words of appreciation, but with actions, my father, King Viserys, has chosen this land, the Point of Cracklaw, as the location of a new dragon sanctuary. Ariel could tell from the expressions alone whom amongst the crowd had heard and whom hadn't. The front rows looked shocked before a slow clap suddenly erupted into enthusiastic cheering. The people further back did not wear surprised expressions, only eager curiosity, but joined the applause and hollering anyway, without any idea of what caused it. Though regardless of who heard, the front rows were already spreading the juicy gossip with the speed of a forest fire. Ariel had to admit the princess was doing rather well, exciting the people with promises of dragons and affluence, instead of making them feel like two foreigners were invading and stealing their land. House Targaryen will see the Point of Cracklaw prosper. Your children will grow up with the sound of dragon songs, and the strength of fire and blood. After a long day of flying, they didn't get back to Dragonstone before sunset. Ariel was worn and ravenous, and the closer they got to home, the keener she felt the winter coldness. Though as the dragon soared homewards, the volcano gradually grew larger and larger. It'd be good to get home, but all things considered, the excursion had been insightful and rather successful, and this would only be one of many visits. She was daydreaming of a filling dinner and the soft warmth of her feathered bed. When they got close enough to make out structures, Ariel could tell something was happening. Inexplicably, there was a ship with the Targaryen sails in black and red by the docks. Despite the setting sun, the dock was full of activity of men unloading the cargo of the ship onto horse-drawn carriages, and a slender, pale blue dragon was hovering in the air, her powerful wings swinging hard up and down to stay airborne as it watched Syrinx and Norbert approaching. It took Ariel a moment to put two and two together, and then she knew her bed would have to wait a little longer. Helena had arrived at Dragonstone.